right. Error handling. The thing about error handling is that when your system is being attacked, the first place you're going to see it show up is in your error logs. And if you don't have error logs, you don't look at error logs, you will not see any of the attacks. So you're going to see all the anomalies show up when you're under attack, because you're going to see parameters that should only contain numbers, and then suddenly you're going to have this error where you're getting, JavaScript, some sort of XSS attack. And you want to make sure that your error handling has a few things. One is you want to be able to audit what's happening with the user. So when the user initiates a wire transfer, you want to know when they did it, how they did it, what IP address, so that it's auditable. So if they come back and say, "Oh, I didn't do that. I didn't even visit your site," you have to know, you have to be able to prove, right, that they actually, their IP address showed up and that they actually did that. Traceable is where, the wire transfer happens on your web application, and then that request is sent to a backend database. Well, that backend database should record everything that's associated with that request. And then when it gets sent to a payment gateway, you want to make sure the payment gateway is recording what's happening with it, so that at any point you can see where the failure occurs in your chain. And you want to make sure that your logs are not writable, because an attacker, if they're able to write to your logs, they can erase their tracks, and you don't want that to happen. Just best practices in general, you want to make sure that you always fail safe or fail closed. You don't want the logs exposed. You can use the auditing log to also monitor your site. It's a really great way to just keep a heartbeat on what's going on in your site. And you want to make sure that when you're reviewing the logs that it's either a copy of your log or a complete replica. You don't want to be using your working copy because you don't want to accidentally erase anything. All right. In general, for error handling, the thing to understand is that you want to make sure that you don't present any sort of data that can be used by an attacker on your production site. So on your development server, it's great to put all sorts of debugging information, but on your production server, you don't want to have a debug mode. You don't want to have it outputting any sort of debugging information that could then give away the paths on your physical hard drive, the type of database you're using. You'll see chuckles. You'll see every so often, you'll see some big site that will have some big long ASP.NET error, and it tells you everything about it. You don't want that. You want that disabled. That shouldn't be on there. It should be something very simple to the end user. Hey, an error has occurred. We've logged it, and we'll take care of it. The administrator is going to notify. Some jurisdictions, and especially for high privacy applications, like medical applications, have legal requirements associated with auditing. You have to be able to prove who did what and when. You get in big trouble. And when you have that kind of a setup, you want to make sure that the log system the system that's actually recording all the logging information, preferably have it central so you don't have to go scrambling about if you do or if you're subpoenaed. And you definitely want to make sure that it's on a trusted system, something that only a few people have access to. Obviously, providing a copy of the data is not so big of an issue for your staff, but you definitely don't want an attacker being able to change it or erase it. All right, file system. Essentially here you want to go with the least amount of privileges possible. You want to protect against an attacker being able to create files, modify files, delete files, because it leads to bad stuff. You can use I tried to look up how to pronounce this, C-Truth. I don't know how to pronounce it, but you want those jails on Unix platforms. Essentially what it does is it confines that process to a particular path on your hard drive. It doesn't allow them to break out of that to get to other areas. Again, you want to choose files, file permissions that are just the bare minimum, just to get the job done. So, and if you can do read-only, that's the best. A lot of times it's not practical, especially if you allow for file uploads and whatnot. User file names, when they provide a user file name, you don't want to use it. You can store it in a database and you can scrub it a bit and remove slashes and stuff and try and clean it up. But when you go to write it onto your disk, create your own file name, some random number or some sort of random string. That way you're assured that they can't then have this file that's written to your hard drive with the name that they choose. Because they might overwrite, and they might put in a path to overwrite your password file. Now they've got their own password that they can use to log into your system. So, of course, input validation, you always want to validate anything that comes from the user. Robots.txt, you definitely want to use that for areas of your site that are somewhat confidential, because what will happen is if, say you use something that's a little more well-known like WordPress, and then what an attacker will do is once they find that there's this vulnerability that affects WordPress sites that have certain attributes, they can do a Google and try and find it. So, and then by finding Google to find all these sites, now they have a list of sites to attack. So if your site doesn't show up, even if it's vulnerable, now you're less likely to be attacked, unless they're just randomly hitting IP addresses all over the internet, which attackers typically don't like to do because it draws attention and it's a waste of time. Now the thing to also remember, it's a double-edged sword because it also tells attackers who are specifically targeting your site where the things you don't want Google going to. So, and of course, if you have files you're not using, outdated files, especially configuration files, a lot of PHP applications have these files that are configuration files. You run them once and then you're supposed to remove them. Some people don't, and then you're able to go back in with that configuration file and reset the password. You want to make sure any file that's not being used gets moved or erased out of the web serving directory. Temporary files, fortunately for us, Lasso, when you upload a file, it goes to a temporary directory that's outside the web serving route, so that's not such an issue. And Apache has an option where you can set it up to where if you don't have an index.lasso file, it'll print out a nice index of all the files that are in that directory. You don't want that, you want to disable that. And then configuration, when you're configuring your services, your Lasso and your Apache and your server in general, security is everybody's responsibility, and make sure you document or back up all your security information, because if something happens to the site, if it's attacked, or the hard drive goes bad, or you have to, or whatever, some disaster strikes, and you have to set it back up, you don't want to miss a security setting that's vital for your site, because it'll leave it wide open. And especially if you're in a hurry situation, if people are trying to shop at your e-commerce site, it's down, you're going to be in a hurry to get it back up as fast as you can. And you don't want to take the time to try and test to make sure that I remember every single security setting that's needed and wanted. Because it'll either prevent users from using your site, or it'll allow users to do more on your site than you're going to want them to do. And obviously, if you are using a framework that has a lot of features and options, the ones that you're not using, you want to disable. I know for myself, for Lasso, I always go in and disable all the connectors that I don't use, because I don't use Oracle and FileMaker. So I disable all of those by default. Make sure there's no default accounts, or especially in our case, a lot of times there's test accounts. You want to make sure that those accounts are disabled. You don't want to add in backdoors, especially on a production system. It's great for a developer just to kind of quickly go in and say, okay, I want to be the administrator, so I hit Alt Control F, and suddenly I'm the administrator. You don't want that in a production system. Don't do that. Again, no passwords in plain text. Use SSL when you can. And very important is always keep the software on your server up to date, because there's constantly, if you follow BugTrack, there are constantly patches for all sorts of vulnerabilities. If you don't keep it updated, I guarantee you someone will exploit it on your system.